We have been given the scientific knowledge, the technical ability, and the materials to pursue the exploration of the universe. To ignore these great resources would be a corruption of a God-given ability.
Gene Cernan, a NASA astronaut newly selected with the class of 1963, remembered the moment vividly in his memoir. It took a special person to overwhelm us, and Wernher von Braun was just such a man. To the American public, we were shining and daring heroes, but in the presence of Herr Doktor, we were mere schoolboys with dreams to fly in space. We were smart. He was brilliant, the man who was creating those magnificent rockets that would take us to the moon. We furnished the bodies, and he furnished the brains. In a Houston restaurant one evening, where he had gathered 4 rookie astronauts before any of us had flown, I realized that the big German was much more than a scientist. He was a visionary and a philosopher, perhaps the Jules Verne of our time, able to peer into the future. Von Braun nudged a silver-top salt shaker as if pushing a toy. "Gene, you are going to need mobility. We will provide a car." In his mind, we would leave the moonlander, get out, and explore the untracked and unknown dirt of an alien landscape. A decade later, in 1972, as the commander of Apollo 17, Gene Cernan would drive that car. Von Braun's idea became General Motors' Lunar Rover, which Cernan drove across the surface of the Taurus-Littrow Valley on the moon. In this moment, 2 men from opposite sides of a world war shared a dream of spaceflight, but this collision of cultures were no accident. In fact, it was the result of choices made long before the Apollo program, long before the creation of NASA, and long before the space race dominated the Cold War. My name is Jason Beck, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In this project, I will trace the overlooked origins of American spaceflight, a process that began not with John F. Kennedy or Wernher von Braun, but with the quiet decisions made by Harry Truman at the dawn of the Cold War. We often tell the story of Apollo as the triumph of inspirational vision. Kennedy's plea before Congress and the American people. Johnson's relentless drive to make the moon landing by Kennedy's end-of-decade deadline. Nixon's voice on the line from the White House to the moon. These are the presidential memories that live in the popular mind, along with speeches, the countdowns, grainy black and white footage, and the image of a boot print in the lunar dust. But visionary leadership is only part of the story. In fact, it's not even the beginning. The deeper truth is quieter, more bureaucratic, and far more complicated. This project challenges the myth that great achievements come from great speeches. Instead, it traces Apollo's origins to decisions made in the chaotic final days of World War II. These decisions, shaped by fear, pragmatism, and the early logic of the Cold War, were never meant to lead to the moon, but did. Eisenhower built the architecture. Kennedy set the goal. Johnson carried the program forward. But beneath this familiar lineage lies one missing name: President Harry Truman, the man who planted the seed without ever taking credit for the harvest. In July of 1969, as Nixon spoke to Armstrong and Aldrin on the lunar surface, former President Johnson had watched the launch from the VIP stands at Cape Kennedy, celebrated as the father of the program. Kennedy was remembered as its visionary grandfather. Eisenhower's remembered as the institutional architect, its great-grandfather. But the only living president who made no public statement about Apollo 11 was Harry Truman. But the program can be said to have begun during his presidency. In the chaotic aftermath of World War II, Truman faced a world in transition. A former ally, the Soviet Union, began to rise as a threat. A shattered Europe needed to be rebuilt. And a race for scientific expertise took place that would shape the next half-century. Truman authorized Operation Paperclip, a secret program that brought more than 1,600 German scientists to the United States. This was not a decision driven by dreams of spaceflight. It was driven by fear of a resurgent, vengeful Germany, fear of a rising Soviet Union, by the urgency of national defense. America could not afford to let its former enemies become its rivals' greatest asset. Truman's leadership was pragmatic, cautious, and often ambivalent, but it laid the foundation for all the achievements that followed, from the Redstone missile to the Saturn V moon rocket. Operation Paperclip brought to America the engineers who had built the V-2, Germany's feared vengeance weapon, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, and the technological ancestor of every rocket that followed, from Redstone to Saturn V. Popular culture later captured the uneasy pride of this achievement. In the movie The Right Stuff, a character clearly inspired by Wernher von Braun steps from the shadows of a cabinet meeting to declare, "Our Germans are better than their Germans." The line is meant to be humorous. The history behind it is not. These scientists carried with them extraordinary expertise and equally extraordinary moral baggage. Their work had fueled the regime responsible for unimaginable atrocities. Some of them had been directly involved. Now, their knowledge would fuel America's Cold War ambitions. This was the ethical compromise at the heart of America's space age. To understand Truman's role, I turned to the archives. With my trusty, if sometimes reluctant, research assistants, I pored over documents such as War Committee meeting minutes, cabinet memoranda, executive orders, intelligence reports, personal papers, and oral histories. These documents reveal a president navigating uncertainty, ambiguity, anxiety, and the weight of rebuilding a post-war world. My research took me beyond a single archive. I worked in both the Truman and Eisenhower presidential libraries, tracing how early Cold War decision-making unfolded across administrations. And I spent time at the Kansas Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, studying the captured V-2 hardware and early American rocketry that grew out of those decisions. And I relied heavily on the National Archives online collection, which opened up thousands of digitized documents that shaped the post-war world. My approach combined close reading with contextual analysis, comparing items such as reports, cabinet meeting minutes, with personal papers and oral histories. I looked very carefully at what was left in the record, and sometimes even what was left out. The archive is not just a record of decisions. It's a record of anxieties, ambitions, insights, clues, and the bureaucratic machinery that turned wartime expertise into Cold War strategy. What emerged from the archive was a portrait of a president who was neither naive nor fully informed. Instead, it shows a leader navigating fragmentary intelligence, pressure from military advisors, criticism from the media, and a deep personal discomfort with employing former Nazis. I found that Truman did not envision spaceflight, but instead prioritized long-term national defense. His approval of Paperclip was not a passive signature. It was an active choice, shaped by fear of Soviet expansion and a belief that scientific expertise, even of former enemies, should not be monopolized behind the Iron Curtain. The archival record also reveals how much information was filtered before it reached him. Reports downplayed the scientists' wartime activities, emphasized their technical value, and framed the program as temporary. Truman's decision was made within this curated informational environment, which explains both his ambivalence and his ultimate approval. These findings show that Truman's role in the origins of American spaceflight was neither visionary nor accidental. It was the product of a specific Cold War mindset that privileged capability over ethics, but which also quietly set the stage for the rockets that would one day carry Americans to the moon. Operation Paperclip lives on not just in documents, but also in public memory. Sites like Fort Bliss, Texas, White Sands, New Mexico, and Camp Evans in New Jersey preserve the physical traces of this history. Their National Park Service designations explicitly acknowledge the role of paperclip scientists in shaping America's missile and space programs. Films like Ice Station Zebra and The Right Stuff dramatize the anxieties of the era, turning the conflict between our Germans and their Germans into a cultural shorthand. Public memory tends to celebrate the triumph of Apollo while forgetting the compromises that made it possible. Museums, movies, and textbooks often smooth over ethical tensions that define the early Cold War. But those tensions are essential to understanding how America reached the moon. This research reframes Apollo not as a result of visionary inspiration or a dream of traveling the stars, but as a product of Cold War pragmatism. Truman's decisions, while cautious, ambivalent, and occasionally ethically fraught, laid the groundwork on which the space age was built. If Kennedy can be said to be the grandfather of Apollo, then Truman may very well be its great-great-grandfather. His legacy is not in the speeches he gave, but the choices that he made. These choices, beginning with the signature on an order to authorize Operation Paperclip, carried Americans all the way to the moon.